Welcome everyone to our fourth session on whether or not Israeli history is part of Jewish history. I suspect the answer to that question will be yes, but that we'll have to take some time to figure it out. I'm Derek Penslar and I teach Jewish history at Harvard. Because of illness, Michael Brenner can't be with us, but substituting for him is Susanna Heschel. Thank you so much, Susanna, for agreeing to pinch hit. A sad reference to last night's baseball game. I just want you to know the Canadians are so polite that they lost on purpose because they knew it would make the Dodgers feel bad. I just want to make that clear. So, Susanna Heschel, you already heard, is the Eli Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth. Our other panelists, Alex Kay, who holds the Stowell Family Chair in Israel Studies and directs the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University, and Leora Halpern, who is a professor of history and international relations at the University of Washington. And I'm going to start with a question about the relationship between the Jewish past and Israeli history. All of us, I would imagine many of you in the room today, grew up with a certain narrative, a way of thinking about the relationship between Israel and the Jewish past, something encapsulated in Israel's own Declaration of Independence, of a people formed in the ancient land of Israel, who lived there for centuries, thrived, prospered, and then were driven from their homeland, but retained their memory of their homeland, prayed for it 3 times a day, waiting eagerly for their return. And then in the 19th century came the Great Return, and the state of Israel emerged from the ashes of the Holocaust, and everything's been fine ever since. So, but this narrative of not just a deep connection between Jewish history and that of the state of Israel, but an absolutely essential and inevitable, ineluctable connection. Now, obviously we're historians and we know it's a bit more complicated than that, but it's important to understand to what extent, despite all of our efforts to complicate it, nonetheless there is something there that Jews did decide that they would, when they decided to form a homeland, that it would not be in East Africa or in Western Canada or in all the other places that the territorialists considered. So I want to start by asking Alex, since you work very deeply in the field of Jewish history, as well as the history of Zionism in Israel, how do you approach this question of the relationship between Israeli history and Jewish history, especially given Zionism's own self-proclaimed sense of rebellion, of rupture, and of subversion, which is so important to the Zionist project, and yet would you also consider it to be an ineluctable or essential part of Jewish history?
Thanks so much, Derek, and thanks everybody for being here and for inviting us to this really important and beautiful day of discussion. Look, there's a dry answer to the question, and then there's a deeper answer to the question. Of course, Israeli history and Jewish history are deeply linked for all of the reasons that were already mentioned, and it's not just because of Zionism's sort of self-definition as a Jewish national movement, but because Israel is a place where half the world's Jews live, that has been part of the most incredible renaissance of Jewish languages in the plural and cultures over the past few decades, and of course has been one of the great experiments in Jewish political thought and action over the past 2 millennia. Not the only such experiment, but one of the most important such experiments. And at the same time, of course, Israeli history is not only Jewish history by any means. Roughly 25% of the citizens of Israel, not even the people who are under Israeli control, but the citizens of Israel, roughly 25% of them are not Jewish by any possible definition, and it would be a deep disservice to the field of Israeli history if Judaism and Jewish history were the only things that seemed to matter. Just a note about Derek's observation that Zionism itself always saw itself really from the start as in some ways a rebellion, a revolt, a disconnect from what had come beforehand in Jewish history. This immediately brings to mind, to me, I don't know if anybody here has been to the museum in Jerusalem, the National Museum, Thank you. The Israel Museum it's been a long day. The Israel Museum in Jerusalem. If you walk in to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, one of the first things that you see in Pride of Place is Yitzhak Danziger's statue of Nimrod. Okay, it's a statue that was commissioned by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. The Israel Museum didn't exist yet. And Danziger was a member of the Canaanite movement. Okay, this is a group of Jews who were self-described anti-Zionists, and one of the core aspects of their ideological program was to essentially depart from Judaism, almost defeat Judaism to create a new kind of person, which was the new Hebrew. And Yitzhak Danziger, as part of that program, created for the Hebrew University of Jerusalem a statue of Nimrod, who in the rabbinic tradition is a great rebellious king that the rabbis do not like at all. And there is Nimrod, the uncircumcised statue based on kind of Egyptian iconography. The Hebrew University of Jerusalem did not like the statue at all. And yet, not long later, it is there as one of the great icons of the modern Zionist movement and has been kind of metabolized into the story of not just Zionism, but also, I would say, of Jewish history. And if Danziger were alive today, I don't know what he would have to say about that, but one doesn't get a say in one's own legacy. That's how history works.
So moving from maybe statues to the world of text, Susanna, so much of your work in Jewish thought, Jewish religious thought, and then the encounter between 20th century Jewry and Zionism, just thinking about Gershom Scholem's highly complicated relationship with Zionism, and again, the sense of rupture, of apocalypse, but also the fact that someone like Scholem, I mean, he chose to move to Eretz Israel. So in your own work, to what extent do you also think of Zionism as continuity, rupture, the kind of people who you've worked on? How did they make sense out of the same issue?
Well, these are great questions, and they're huge questions that deserve days and days of discussion. I think we have to distinguish between what a historian looks at when we think about the connection between Jewish history and Israel, first of all, and that's one way. But then if we look at Zionist thinking, and there are many different kinds of Zionism, including, and by the way, Yonatan Matosh's family gave us some of his material at Dartmouth from the Canaanite movement. And I also have to just say, you know, there's something sweet about talking about the Canaanite movement. There's a sweet moment in the past that, you know, and I hope that some of the problems we face today, some of the anti-Zionists, will also look back in 100 years and say, you know, they were sweet, they're gone now. And it was just one of those moments, but okay. Anyway, when we look from the perspective of Zionist thought or of Israeli thought, at the way they think about Jewish history and how they use Jewish history for various purposes of their own, ideological, political, and so on, as everybody does, of course, then, you know, we see some other things. Now, of course, what you said about Scholem saw danger, but and so did Uriel Tal, who was my doctoral advisor, but of course, with a heart, a desperate heart, I think, fear, which is a bit different from, let's say, a dismissive attitude. And I think we have to also consider here, since you were just mentioning history of emotions, the emotions of the scholar. I teach a course on the '67 war with a colleague who works on Egypt. And there are times when my heart just stops. I'm very upset. It's a real history that I have to deal with, but it's painful. And that's an element here, and how the historian thinks about Jewish history or about Israel. There are things that hurt my heart, but I have to confront. I would just say, as a last point, you know, Zionism is supposed to be a negation of the diaspora, which really means the negation of the last 2,000 years of Jewish history, of Golus, of Galut. But sometimes, you know, they didn't really negate it. Sometimes it feels to me in Israel, there's a lot of Golus there. And we haven't really overcome, nor should we necessarily. There are some good things that we as diaspora Jews also contribute to Israel. So the negation that is part of it, there are the wonderful things that have actually helped create Israel. I would say let me be a little ironic. When Israel celebrates Independence Day by flying big jet planes and tanks through the streets of Jerusalem, That's gullus. Yeah? I would like Israel to celebrate in a different way its great achievements or its joy at existing, and not with fighter jets and such things. Those we need, sure, but that's not the celebration of that moment. That's more like what Zionists always called a gullus mentality.
Yeah, it reminds me of in Herzl's novel Alt Neuland, there's no army in the future Jewish homeland. There's no army, and there's no borders. And, you know, it's ironic. The author of a pamphlet called The Jewish State, actually his great utopian vision was of something that would not be a state, at least not in any conventional sense of the word. But, you know, we can talk about the Canaanites and Ratosh, and we can talk about Danziger's Nimrod. These are fantasies. These are fantasies of a Middle East that never was, an ancient Middle East that never was, and of a kind of future utopian Hebraic-dominated Middle East. But Leora, you're a scholar of the real Middle East. Right? You work on... Well, you work with Arabic sources.
Yeah.
You work on the Middle East, I would think, much more directly and immediately than the rest of us on this panel. And so in your own work on Zionism and on Israel, within the context of, among other things, the Middle East, how does that kind of training and that kind of background change the way you think about the connection between Israel and the Jewish past?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. It's an honor to be on the panel with all of you. I think some of my answers resemble the answers that we've heard already, that the question itself lends itself to several different directions of inquiry. We could answer that, yes, of course, Israeli history is Jewish history because it can't be narrated without the frame of Jewish history, and even arguably that the history of Palestinians within Israel is inflected and shaped by Jewish history. We could also argue, no, it is not necessarily Jewish history because, indeed, there is a significant Palestinian minority, and then there's also a much larger population of Palestinians under Israeli control, but outside the polity of the state. But we could also potentially answer no to the question because perhaps Israel has transcended Jewishness and has become a nation like other nations, or at least one that can be analyzed analytically alongside other nations, and does not have to be analyzed along the lines of its Jewishness, but along the lines of what kind of state it is or it isn't. But I want to actually say something else here that I've been thinking about lately as we were getting ready for this symposium, which takes us back to the substance of the first panel today, which is that Jewish history itself, as an undertaking, emerged in a moment of profound communal crisis and was itself an expression of rebellion against a variety of communal norms, of what many believed it meant to be Jewish. So we can't talk about the emergence of Jewish history without talking about the pressures of the Enlightenment, Reform Judaism, liberalism, and then later Zionism and socialism. And the practitioners of Jewish history promoted and also negotiated crises via a number of very vexing questions that in their own way were political questions at the time about whether Jews could or should be thought of as a political nation or a political group, whether Jewish history should be thought of as single-centered with one center or multi-centered, whether Jewish history might be thought of as a story of economics. All of these in different ways were provocations, right? Because each of them was presenting different ideas about what it meant to do or practice Jewish history. And so I could argue that Jewish history is a history that illuminates and refracts the most profound Jewish crises of the day, right? That is the quintessential Jewish history, which means that a history whose practitioners are told they are heretics, whose frames and conclusions and their adjacency to non-Jewish fields puts them at odds with Jewish communal narratives, perhaps might be the quintessential practitioners of Jewish history, but also those who win admirers among those who imagine from different directions that history can chart a path through crisis or within crisis are Jewish historians. And today, among all the fields of Jewish history that the folks in this room study, it's Israeli history that is most today attracting and refracting the crises of our moment, which are crises in Israel, also about Israel's relationship to Palestine and Palestinians. And what fascinates me is the way these struggles among historians and also between historians and various publics are themselves the sort of thing that will soon become primary sources in our own historiography, right? Our study of the study of Jewish history. And that to me is quite fascinating. But by the same token, as much as I get inspiration from the heterodox essence of Jewish history, we also need to remember that Jewish history isn't only by and for Jews. And I'm particularly interested in the way Palestinians can and do write Jewish history. And I'm thinking, for example, of a recent book by Arish Sabah-Khoury, who wrote almost entirely on the basis of Hebrew language archival sources written by Jews. Right? Is this a Palestinian history? Well, yes, but also in all kind of meaningful ways, it's also a Jewish history, right? But that's someone writing outside of these internal Jewish debates about what it means to write a Jewish history. So all of these are provocative and, to me, really exciting parts of trying to think about the parameters and scope of our fields.
Well, what you're saying really shows that it's impossible to talk about, as we've seen quite often in our discussions today, that as soon as we start talking about the past, we immediately leap into the present. Partly because of presentism, and particularly in the case of Israel, it becomes very difficult to talk about any aspect about Israel without immediately leaping into politics. And this is something I've noticed throughout my years in academia, particularly since I came to Harvard, that you can have a weekly seminar on Middle Eastern politics and history, you can have an event on Syria or Iran or Yemen or whatever, and there'll be, obviously, people will be unhappy about things that are being discussed, but there's a very high academic level and a very strong level of professionalism. And then there'll be something about Israel, Palestine, and the nature of the event changes markedly. It becomes extremely emotional, and people are acting out political scripts, and sometimes academic professionalism simply goes out the window. So let's move, substantially, since you already began to push us in this direction, let's move substantially into the present. And Susanna, in some ways, what you do at Dartmouth has become kind of a model of how people can talk about Israel in the broader Middle Eastern context, Israel and Palestine. And I think I've talked with you about this before because we're all trying to adopt the Dartmouth model. Basically, how is it that you're able? How do you teach about Israel in that environment? Why do you think it has taken place without the kind of rancor, or at least not as much less, than even at my own august institution?
So at Dartmouth, where I chair Jewish studies, we work closely with our colleagues in Middle Eastern studies. We have wonderful colleagues. The reason we have wonderful colleagues is, first of all, because we were involved in selecting them. I would say that if we have problems at some universities, I actually blame it on those deans who rubber stamp hiring and tenure. And there's too much of that. And that's the level at which the problems, I think, have taken shape. At any rate, we co-teach courses, we co-sponsor lectures and workshops and so on. I'm interested in the history of Jewish scholarship on Islam in the 19th century in Germany. We have things in common to talk about. So we co-teach these courses. And on October 7th, the chair of Middle Eastern Studies phoned me. He sounded, and then, or maybe it was the next day, and he sounded horrible. And he sounded the way I felt. And I told him he was in Cairo to lead an alumni trip. I told him I was going to organize something for faculty in our building. He said, open it to students. So we did. But the president of Dartmouth, who had just arrived, called me Monday morning and asked if we could do something. And I said, we've already set it up. So, but the point is that the president called the faculty. The president didn't call, I don't know, the student life advisors or something, or the DEI people. And so we had a panel of 4 faculty, 2 afternoons. Place was packed. I had no idea so many people would show up, but really students came, masses of them, and on live stream. And the point was to show them that there is a way to speak to one another in an academic context that is not the way you talk in a dormitory lounge or in a restaurant and so on. And that's what we want to cultivate. And that's what we've done in our classes also, to create a sense of community that also comes because we model in co-teaching how we talk to each other in a classroom setting, in an academic setting. So that's been very, very important. I would say, of course, my father always said, don't become an academic because it's so painful, the academic politics is so terrible. And all I can say is he was right. And of course, all the great things that my colleagues and I have done at Dartmouth has also produced a backlash from some of our very left-wing colleagues who are, angry at us and so on. So nothing goes smoothly in academia. I would just finally like to say, why is there so much focus right now? As Lior pointed out, there are intellectual reasons. I think there's something else going on here. I have the feeling that Gaza represents Christ on the cross, and the Christ who is suffering, the worst suffering in the world, and who is atoning for sin, so therefore the highest moral level, and people are identifying with that, and that's an underlying myth in the fantasies. I don't think that's the only thing going on. Obviously, there's a war, there's suffering, and people are dying, and it's horrific. And I'm appalled by what has emerged in this terrible, terrible situation, of course. But I ask myself, why is it my colleagues who work on trans theory and Asian Americans and so on, why are they so obsessed with this? And I think we need to ask ourselves, what has become of us and our field in their fantasies? What function do we play in their fantasies, apart from the academic scholarship, or in addition to it? There is a way in which Jewish studies is a fantasy in the minds of people in the fields of outside Jewish studies.
This is a really important point about how academics in Jewish studies, including Israel studies, are faced with just a minefield of difficult choices and difficult issues that do not face people who work in other aspects of the humanities and the social sciences. So, Alex, you teach about Israel and you also run an Israel Studies Center. And so you see it from both perspectives. You see it in the classroom, but you also have the administrative decisions to make about hiring or, little things like who are you going to invite to give a colloquium? And what aspects of Israel studies are you going to emphasize and what aspects might you perhaps not emphasize? So what do you think, as you think of what Israel studies even means today within academia as such, what do you think are the most positive and constructive aspects of Israel studies that you think can really bring something to the university? Are there aspects of Israel studies that you think are a little bit more problematic?
The first thing everyone needs to understand is that Israel studies as a field is thriving. And I don't mean in terms of resources or number of hires or whatever else. We can talk about those things as well. Obviously, every field is always in need of more resources to further its important virtuous aims. But intellectually speaking, Israel studies is absolutely going gangbusters. So at Brandeis University, where I direct the System and Center for Israel Studies, we have a summer seminar called the Summer Institute for Israel Studies, where we bring faculty who are not experts in Israel, but who want to learn more so they can teach it in their home institutions. And they come from literally every continent except Antarctica. We have people from all over Asia, Africa, all over Europe, South and North America, who are coming because they are desperate to come to a place where they know that they can trust that they will get a solid, even measured appreciation for all of the different aspects of the field of Israel studies. We started a couple of years ago a new institute called the Institute for Advanced Israel Studies. This is for people who are experts in the field. I set this up, we're now in our third year of this. Every year we have a theme. This year, 80 people applied for 12 slots, okay, from all over the world on the theme of the Israeli diaspora. We have a different theme every year. Just in terms of the number of senior, very seasoned, very brilliant scholars who are interested in this work, it's astonishing. I'm a co-editor of the Journal of Israeli History, and our center also sponsors the journal Israel Studies. Both of those have been publishing really, really high quality articles for a period of time. Publishing is going really remarkably well. the field of Israel studies is also opening up to relationships to other kinds of fields, certainly Middle East studies, but also, everything from anthropology and queer theory, certainly history and so on, but also literature, comparative literature, dance studies and theater studies, performance studies, and so on and so on. Really, 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 really thriving. There is no question that there are challenges. One of the key challenges that I foresee we will have to contend with, we already are contending with, but which will get even harder in the coming years, is the question of academic boycotts, the boycott of individuals, Israeli individuals or people that are even associated with Israel studies. Of course, that on its face is a terrible thing, but it's especially terrible for people, you asked about what it means to be a director of a center, and one of the things that we take great pride in doing is to absolutely vigorously insist that we are a space that people of all different kinds of perspectives should come, and as long as people kind of can engage with each other in a constructive way, really any position is welcome in our doors, okay? But for that to happen, it means that people have to be allowed to come into the United States and not get turned away because they don't get visas, as has happened for a number of Palestinian scholars. And it has to be that people are willing to speak to each other in all kinds of ways. The very last thing I'll say, and I'll say this briefly, but I think we could talk about this for a lot longer, is, look, the world is on fire, okay? Everything is really, 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 really difficult. And I challenge anybody to, in most of the ways that we engage with people in our daily life, I challenge people to find an example of a conversation that they could go into and just have a constructive, reasoned, empathetic, curious, open-minded conversation with a person that they've never met before on this topic and feel good about it, okay? It's exceptionally, vanishingly rare. You know where it happens? In our classrooms. Okay, it happens in our classrooms because I don't know what you read in the press, but if you get into the classroom, you see that our students and almost, speak of myself, almost all of our colleagues, not just our own universities, but other universities too, are deeply invested in having a different kind of conversation. So if you want the antidote to what's going on in every corner of the world today, help and support the study of Jewish and Israeli history.
Excellent. I think all of us, when we talk about the classes that we teach, we have very different stories to tell from, as we heard this morning, the difference between the classroom and the quad. That what happens in Harvard Yard is very different from what happens in my classroom, where last term I had 55 students in a class on Israel-Palestine, half Jewish, half not, all from all over the world, literally from all over the world. We may have even had somebody from Antarctica, I don't know. And, we got along, and people learned from each other. But, so Lior, I want to, since as I think by far the oldest person on the panel, I want a very brief anecdote and then ask you a question, which is, so when I started off in graduate school a million years ago, to study Israel meant to study the labor movement, and to study one aspect or another of some petty quarrel between the members of the labor parties who eventually went on to establish the State of Israel. And in your graduate formation, of course, there's the history of, it seems to me that one very important element is, again, Mizrahi Jews in Israel, Mizrahi, the role of Arabic through both non-Jewish Palestinians, but also Arabic-speaking or so-called Arab Jews. And then the issue of religiosity, which is, I think, was also ignored in the earlier historiography. My sense now is that when we teach about Israel, we teach a much more complicated history than we used to. And I was wondering just how you do this in your own teaching and in your research, and how you find if your students are receptive to this.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think my students, and I would echo what Alex says about the classrooms being these really remarkable spaces in which students, at least at my university, the University of Washington, the vast majority are not Jewish. They're coming from any number of backgrounds, a lot of first-generation students from different places, right? They really want an overall sense of the history of Israel-Palestine. And for them, understanding the nuances of Israeli history is as important as understanding the nuances of Palestinian history. So for me, as I conceptualize the field and as I think about the most exciting developments in the field, it's a field that very much transcends nation-state frames. Not that there's not, of course, a nation-state at the center, but one that we can think about backwards through time, from the Ottoman period to the British Mandate period, to think across space, across empires, migration to and from Israel or Palestine in light of broader migration flows, ideological movement across space, the movement of capital, investment, and the creation of businesses. All of these things are transnational fields, and students are very excited to engage with these themes in a way that illuminates Jewish history and also illuminates Palestinian history. I think somebody on one of the earlier panels said that our courses, our study, is one of the best ways to fight against anti-Semitism. And in my view, and this has borne out over now more than a decade of teaching, to really complicate and humanize the various Jewish actors in the Palestine-Israel space, alongside humanizing the diverse Palestinian actors in that space, as well as several diasporas, is the way that you build an integrated history in which anti-Semitism just doesn't make sense anymore, but also different other kinds of hatred that I hope we also would want to push against also don't feel tenable anymore. And because Israel or Israel-Palestine are such a space of intersection, of encounter along so many different lines, it is such a wonderful place to start thinking about how do you engage particularity and also engage interconnection within a society and also across these different global dimensions.
It's a very positive image of what we can do in the university, but I also think we need to have the humility. We have to understand what we can and what we can't do. I often get asked by my students, they say towards the end of the semester in a course on Israel-Palestine, they'll say, well, do we now know how to solve the conflict, or will our course teach you how to solve the conflict? And what I tell them is, no, learning the history of Israel-Palestine will not in and of itself solve the conflict, but you will not be able to solve it without knowing that history. It's a necessary, if not sufficient, precondition. And that's enough for them. But this question of the future of what we can do as professors of Israeli history and Jewish history, or Jewish studies and Israeli studies, brings to mind a fear that I have that I want to share with you all and ask for your reactions about the future. You know, David Meyer said earlier that I think the term used was congenital optimist and situational pessimist. Yep. So the way I put it is I'm a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist. So it's something similar. But I do worry about Israel studies as a field becoming a pariah discipline. And it has to do with a series of pressures within the intramurally. I think it comes from the left and from people who attack Israel, and then extramurally, talk about, but they claim they do. And it makes our work very hard. Lior, you may have come across this article by Ian Lustig recently where he talks about 3 different ways of critiquing Israel in an academic framework. One is criticism of a government, one is criticism of a regime, and one is criticism of a state as such. And lots of people criticize governments. I mean, academics do that all the time. It's not, and people criticize regimes. They say that a regime is unfair to a particular community that needs to become more egalitarian or less corrupt or something. But there are very few, I can't think of really any other cases in the world where people might argue for state extinction. That is, no one really talks about eliminating Russia, they talk about transforming Russia or China or so forth. And I feel that in certain pockets of academia, I won't name any universities because I think this is actually happening in a variety of places, that Israel is in such bad odor that to teach about it in any way other than as the, quote, oppressor, dispossessor of the Palestinians leaves everything out, the government, the culture, the politics, everything. So how, you say Israel studies thriving, and I'm really interested in this, about what it means to thrive. Maybe Brandeis, there's, you know, you're particularly successful, but to the extent that Israel is conceived in such a Manichaean manner, how is it possible to maintain Israel studies in the future? Because obviously, Alex, we want whatever you're doing at Dartmouth, whatever you're doing at Brandeis, we want it to spread and to continue. But this is really my fear, that not only does that criticism then come from the left, but then from the right, there's a whole other level of policing that's making it very difficult, to the point that my students last semester, they were like afraid. Can we speak up in class? Can we speak our mind? And I told them, well, yes, and I mean, I hope I was right. But I told them yes. So do you share these concerns, or do you feel that what you're doing at Dartmouth, what's happening at Brandeis, what's happening in Seattle, that this is somehow navigating these very difficult... So let's hear, Leora, from you first about...
Yeah. Yeah, I have a lot of optimism about the shape of the scholarship, about the range of intersecting fields that are producing knowledge about Israel, including Jewish history and Middle East history, as well as other comparative fields. But I have very profound concerns, and one of them is that our institutions are the institutions that support us, right? Without the frameworks to fund and facilitate this work, what happens when the secular or federal or ecumenical sources of funding dry up and we're more and more reliant on Jewish-supported, some of which is ideologically supported funding? What happens when our peers, sometimes friends and colleagues in the humanities, are seeing programs or positions slashed while Jewish studies, kind of like a Noah's Ark, is sort of floating on the water, right? Certainly within that ark, very good scholarship could potentially be created, but the tides are rising and falling for everyone. So as vibrant as those Jewish institutions might be, I don't think that kind of model where we stay afloat thanks to funding can produce anything approaching a golden age of scholarship, right? For me, the exciting developments in the field have to do with the cross-fertilization between multiple fields, right? Of comparison, of transnational movement, that to me are some of the most exciting advances. It can't happen when our peers in other fields are withering on the vine. And so as much as I want to say to all of you, support Jewish history, and you're here because you do support Jewish history, I hope you also see the importance of supporting humanities and social science scholarship across the disciplines, right, to build that kind of infrastructure of collaboration that actually creates great Jewish studies scholarship. I also, I also feel the real tension between, on the one hand, the opportunity and imperative to be engaging broader publics, and also the pressure to, kind of stay in an ivory tower, like don't weigh in on anything political, like don't, right? How do you navigate that space, and how do you do what honestly is some of the most exciting work of being a Jewish historian, which is engaging publics, and honestly not only Jewish publics. I've gone to multiple local churches and community colleges, and it's been some of the most meaningful things, while also being a person in the world shaped by circumstances, shaped by what I know and what I hear. And I think one thing that I think through, and I think this will be the last thing that I say on this point, I know that as historians and as people, as publics, we're operating after October 7th. We're living after the destruction of Gaza. We are thinking, though, of not only the things that have most recently occurred, the ceasefire, for example, even more recently, but we have deeper memories. We're writing after the destruction of the First and Second Temple in Jerusalem, the Holocaust, Jewish displacement and migration, decolonization, COVID, the second Trump election, right? And each of us is going to connect the dots about what are the relevant paths that, right, we are expected to have on our minds, right? How can we engage publics in a way that brings our expertise, brings our many years of teaching and knowledge in a way that is engaging with the sorts of concerns and histories, including much more distant and also recent, that our audiences have on their minds. So I think it involves being very nimble, right? And being very aware of who we're speaking to at different moments.
So that we're going to segue into the questions. I'm posing a question both to Alex and to Susanna regarding the future of Israel studies, and picking up on some of the things you were saying, Leora, about how we have to reach out, of course, to the university as a whole, which is about Middle Eastern studies and Islamic studies. You have the Crown Center, right, at Brandeis. for Middle Eastern studies, and then Suzanne, earlier you were talking about your own work with Middle Eastern studies. The relationship between Israel studies, Israeli history, Jewish studies, Jewish history, Middle Eastern studies, it can be a complex relationship. I've taught at a few different universities. The relationship between people who work on Israel and people who work on the Middle East has often been fraught. And again, on a scholarly level, you refer to Arish Savakuri's book. So this is a woman who is herself, she's a Palestinian from Israel, so she has native Hebrew as well as Arabic. And she wrote a book that was, I think, theoretically very sophisticated analysis of the mandate period and the relationship between the Hashem Eretz Seir Kibbutzim and local Palestinians. On a micro level, it was a really interesting book. But more broadly speaking, I find it difficult. I mean, it's not impossible, but difficult to have these kinds of collegial relationships with people who specialize in particularly 20th century. It's easier to deal with the Ottomanists. And so if you could just speak a little bit about your own sense of how Israel studies can, should, or finds it difficult to engage with Middle Eastern studies, or particularly the idea of Israel-Palestine studies as a kind of common enterprise.
We're very blessed at Brandeis that my center is there, the Center for Israel Studies, and as Derek mentioned, we also have the Crown Center for Middle East Studies, and I'm very close with the director and all of the faculty there. We very frequently co-sponsor events or put on events together, speak at each other's events. The week after October 7th, I worked very closely with the Crown Center to put on a very widely viewed event, which had our own faculty and also experts from different Middle Eastern contexts. But I know that I'm lucky, and that's a highly unusual state of affairs. I found it already somewhat challenging, but not yet impossible, to put on, events around contemporary Israel and Palestine, whether it be, literary events or political or historical events, to kind of convince people that it's okay to work with us, even if you're from this side of the spectrum or that side of the spectrum. But I'm afraid to say I completely affiliate with what you said earlier regarding the future of Israel and the Israel studies and the question of whether this discipline will become a kind of pariah discipline, and that is a terrifying and very real prospect for me. I think not that this is a salve, but it is a kind of framework that I work a lot with, both in the classroom and outside, is to try and kind of broadcast the intellectual framing that, I actually say this slightly differently because Susanna earlier today already mentioned sadism, and just now you brought up this kind of the idea of Jewish studies and maybe Israel studies as well being a kind of fantasy. So just to kind of stick with the psychoanalytical frame for a moment, when awful things happen, it can cause neuroses or even psychoses to emerge. And one of the features of neuroses and psychoses is an inability to see the truth in all of its aspects. And how you break through a psychosis or a neurosis is that you try and get the patient to really see the world as it is. Just recently, I was asked to give a talk somewhere about Jewish religious extremism in Israel, and so I did. And at the end of the talk, which was on that subject, a person, and then almost everybody, appreciated it and it was fine, but one person said, but you didn't say anything about what the Palestinians did on October 7th, and which wasn't true as it happened. I had done, but for her, the idea that you could talk about Jewish violence without talking about Palestinian violence, it made her kind of switch off. And I've similarly talked to other kinds of audiences where even the idea of talking about Zionism without immediately qualifying it as kind of a settler colonial movement, et cetera, makes it impossible to think about it. And why I'm talking about this psychoanalytical framing is that I think that one of the things that we can provide by modeling it and by just banging the same drum again and again and again is to encourage people to really believe that it's possible to see the full truth in all of its aspects, that you can hold two or more ideas in your head at the same time, and indeed you need to, unless you're going to, get yourself enveloped in all of these anxieties and neuroses. But that does not, I don't see that alone being the antidote to this mess, and I share your fear about the future.
Are you similarly fearful, or
Am I what?
similarly fearful, or more
Am I
optimistic?
fearful? I'll give you an example of fearful, which is that I'm concerned that Israel studies sometimes receives a reply at some colleges, well, now we want Palestinian studies. And that's based on an assumption that Israel studies has a particular Zionist point of view, and now Palestinians will come with an anti-Zionist point of view, and we'll have some kind of balance. This is nonsense. I also have to emphasize that every scholar in Israel studies talks about Palestinians. You can't talk about Israel without talking about Palestinians. I mean, look at Lior's own scholarship, for example, and Derek and Alex. I mean, this is just the field. So the idea that there's some kind of balance, it's not balanced, no. And I also want to say that Israel studies by itself is part, really, of world studies. That is, you can't talk about Israel without the larger Middle East and without North Africa. And of course, there's Europe and the British Empire, which is concerned at the same time as Balfour with the Irish and Indian demands for home independence, etc. So it involves the world and the United States, etc. There is no way to isolate Israel all by itself. At the same time, my colleagues and I can't stand the introductory textbooks in Middle Eastern studies. And we had a little retreat to talk about how we should rewrite them, because they give a teeny little chapter, little chapter to Israel, and that's it. And because they emphasize all the time everything political, and this great leader, that leader, and so on, and there's some ideological movements, there's nothing about the culture, about literary developments and artistic, and so on. It's not a good fabric for understanding the Middle East, and that needs to be redone. And finally, what we are hoping to do at Dartmouth is to bring graduate students and postdocs and junior faculty to come together for a week or two to talk about how we can work together, Jewish studies, Middle Eastern studies, and try to come up with a kind of collaboration when they go out to their colleges to teach, that they too can pursue. Because that's really what we need to model for our other colleagues at the university, how to collaborate.
Okay, so there are, in the 10 minutes we have left, there's 3 terrific questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pose them, and I'm going to ask each of you to answer one of them. Hopefully you won't all answer the same one, but I'll make up something. I think they're all 3 great questions, so I'll do my best with some of them. First one, to get back to this theme of exactly how does Israeli history then relate to Jewish studies and Jewish history as such. We've been talking largely about history and politics and society, but what about culture, and particularly the Hebrew language? So the role of academic study and use of modern Hebrew within the field of studying Israel, but also modern Jewish studies as such, and I think that's very important. So Hebrew culture, broadly understood. Another question is that if we're talking about the present and the future of Jewish history, that Israel really is the primary maker of Jewish history today. That is, one can feel good about this, one might not feel good about it, but over half of world Jewry lives in Israel. And this is simply the future of Jewish history, lies in Israel. So, and then the third question has to do with something within the United States, which is those people who are not just critical of Israel, but actually identify as anti-Zionist and who are Jewish. And that, perhaps in the name of their Jewishness. And so how do we make sense of Jewish anti-Zionism within a framework of Jewish history? So there are 3 interrelated questions. And again, take whichever ones you want. And they're all equally good. Take your pick, Leora.
Are we allowed to answer components of more than one?
Yes, absolutely. As long as we do it in 9 minutes, yes. Okay. Alex, you want to start?
Is Israel the future of Jewish history? Look, the day started out with Wissenschaft, so let's just go back there for a moment, or at least to the story of Jewish historiography. Look, a lot of Jewish historians, especially in the first, I would say, century plus of the field of Jewish history, thought of Jewish history as a story of Jews in successive centers of migration. Dubnov famously talked about this, but he's not the only one. You know, once upon a time, the Jews were in Judea, and then they moved to Babylonia, and then in the Middle Ages, they were in Western Europe, and then in the early modern period, they went to Eastern Europe. And now the question is, positing the next phase of Jewish history is the Jews in Israel. And there have been other models too. Ravidovich famously talked about these kind of two centers of Jewish history in Israel, but also in the diaspora. In recent years, I think, to the benefit of Jewish studies and the study of Jewish history, can I say most of us have stopped thinking in terms of Jews being in particular centers and everything else being peripheral. And there's been a great diversification of the field of Jewish history in all kinds of ways, but including a geographical diversification and a recognition. I mean, look, when the Jews were in Judea, most Jews were not in Judea, when most of them were in, Assyria somewhere. When the Jews were in Babylonia, they were also in North Africa and southern Spain. When the Jews were in Western Europe, they were also in southern Europe and in other parts of the world as well, and so on and so on. I could give 10,000 examples. We think now of Jewish history in its kaleidoscope of varieties, and we relish, sure, telling big stories and answering big questions, but you can only answer the big questions and tell the big stories through the specificities. So I would say that, it may well be that in the short term or the long term, I don't know, most Jews, some Jews, all Jews, I don't know, will end up in one or other place. But that's not to say that all of Jewish history is now going to be defined by that location. I'll also just say one thing as well, which is one last thing, which is Jewish history is very, 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 very long, and in a way that makes me want to say to everybody, please don't worry. Things could be. This is not to say that things cannot be awful. Demonstrably, they can. But Jewish history is very, very, very long. I don't see an end to it right now. I see massive challenges and definitely huge changes. But as historians, I feel that although part of our goal is to communicate and think about the future and try to solve problems, our primary goal is to describe what we see. And descriptively, things are really, really interesting, and we're very much in the middle of a very, very long story.
So which questions would you like to address?
I want to say a little bit on two different questions. So one is whether Israel is the future of Jewish history. One thing that hasn't really been said, and I think really needs to be said, is that Israeli institutions are some of the most important producers of scholarship on Israeli history, and of course Jewish history generally. And so there's so much being generated there, whole departments of different aspects of Jewish history. Israel is also the home of archives. We haven't talked about that much either, right? For all different aspects of the study of the Jewish past, Israel is the place, and there's a history to this too, why those archives ended up there, where people studying all sorts of aspects of Jews that might have nothing to do with Israel come to and through Israel to do that work. And so Israel, not only as a subject or an object of Jewish history study, but as a location in which that history is taking place, I think just structurally, right, it is positioned to be that way, and there's so much to study about Israel. I also want to say something about the question about anti-Zionism. I think one of the really wonderful aspects of studying Jewish history is we get a really wide and broad understanding of the different ways that Jews have engaged in politics since the time that Jews have engaged in politics. So that's not only relative to Zionism, but Zionism looms very large, right? To understand the many ways that Jews have come to Zionism, sometimes in fits and starts, have interpreted it in a very wide range of ways, have sometimes evolved over their own lifespans, and also the reasons that Jews in different places at different times have either questioned, been suspicious of Zionism, or in some cases been, right, overtly and verbally anti-Zionist. And often we can be quite presentist in sort of imagining that there's only the Zionisms and anti-Zionisms of today, but any Zionism or anti-Zionism or non or post-Zionism has its lineages, right? Like we can trace the through lines of these different currents here in the US and also elsewhere. And that's part of what Jewish history lets us do. It helps us understand that things don't come out of nowhere because someone woke up one day and, sometimes we dismiss the positions we don't like by saying it's shallow and they just came to it for no reason, right? We can understand how that's not the case and that there are these deeper through lines that people will relate to as they take their positions.
Susanna?
Yeah. Wow. So I first of all, Israel is, of course, in the future in such a fantastic location, and so many connections are now being made in the last recent years, with other Arab countries, and that gives me hope. My friends in Lebanon tell me how thrilled the Lebanese are that Israel recently didn't entirely demolish, but partially demolish Hezbollah, and now they have a new government in Lebanon, and they love it. They love Netanyahu in Beirut probably more than in Tel Aviv, I don't know. But I would hope that day will come when we can take a train from Jerusalem to Beirut, to Damascus, to Amman, to Baghdad, and so on, because that's really what I think ultimately everybody would like. And we have to ask ourselves, what are the roadblocks to achieving that kind of joyful connections of all of these countries in that region? I do think that Israel needs a Martin Luther King to overcome some of the anger and tension and racism. I'm not sure that can come with the current Israeli government, frankly. I was very upset that 2 Jewish American women were arrested and deported by Israel because they got involved with Rabbis for Human Rights, helping Palestinians pick olives at a harvest. That's not right. We know that's not right. That blocks Israel's fruitfulness and growth and peace in the Middle East. In terms of the anti-Zionism, when I grew up, there were people who said, there were not only Jews who were anti-religious, they said orthodoxy is over. It's going to be gone in another generation. It's silly, it's absurd. Well, that didn't happen. And I think the anti-Zionism, what can I say? In my grandparents' generation, they were involved in a Agudas Yisrael that was anti-Zionist on religious grounds. Of course, that stopped with the war. We know that. But I think this too will change. There's certain moments we have, and those moments pass. People do change. But I think what's important for us is also to remember that Israel, Zionism, answered a very crucial Jewish question, which is, where can we live and be secure and not be subjected to anti-Semitism and to pogroms, to violence? And that was the whole point. And yes, but we're still working on that, as you know, because October 7th was horrific. And we're still working on that. But let's also remember that's one question. That's not the only Jewish question. We have another Jewish question, many Jewish questions, and one of them would be, what do I do when I'm in despair? What do I do on an October 7th as a Jew? And who responds to that? Hasidism responds to that. Hasidism is concerned about despair and melancholy and what to do about it. So let's just remember that there are many questions and we also have many responses. We haven't yet fully realized them, but we're working on that. And I do think that what everybody wants is to see a peaceful region in the Middle East where everybody is living in their place and happily living there. And it should be Israelis, it should be Arabs, it should be Palestinians. We need to work on that. And I do think it will come to pass. And let's also remember that's another Jewish principle, which is never lose hope.
Well, perhaps to end on that note, and the question about Hebrew language, which I wanted to make sure we address, is that despite all of the political tensions regarding Israel, let's say in university campuses, there's tremendous interest from people, regardless of political stance, in Hebrew. At the universities I've been affiliated with, you often have non-Jewish students taking Hebrew. Modern Hebrew culture develops outside of the land of Israel. It develops in Central and Eastern Europe. It flourishes in late Ottoman and Mandate Palestine and the state of Israel. And often Israeli novelists are people who are able to bridge gaps between whether it's Zionist or non-Zionist Jews or non- or anti-Zionist non-Jews. Hebrew novelists, I know this from a presentation we had at Harvard just last week, are able to bring people together through literature. And for people whose native language is Arabic, learning Hebrew is actually quite easy. For people who know Hebrew, learning Arabic is a bit harder. But it is a form of a bridge, and I've seen this over and over again. And the fact is that although the term anti-Zionism is being used quite widely now, I think it's actually fairly new. I think the term anti-Zionism is used widely in the early 21st century. There's been anti-Zionists for a long time. There are ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionists, there are assimilationist anti-Zionists, there are Bundist anti-Zionists. But anti-Zionism as a kind of a credo is fairly recent. My colleagues at Harvard and I joke about this, that there are Zion Jews and Tzedek Jews. And the Zion Jews are those who have an affiliation with Israel, and there are those who think that their social justice ethos demands a hostility to Zionism. They're a minority. There may be 10 to 15% of the Jewish students at Harvard, so far as we can tell. And their numbers may grow and they may not. They may shrink, as you're saying. But ultimately, the connection between diaspora Jews and Israel, despite all the problems going on in Israel right now, I don't think they're going to go away. And the fact is, I think one thing we can establish is that Israeli history is very much part of Jewish history, and in fact, moving forward, it's going to be even more inseparable from Jewish history, if for no other reasons than for demographic reasons. So it's exactly, I'm 1 minute and 20 seconds over, so I apologize, and thank you very much.